Live.
Namaskar. Good evening. Welcome to the 10th day of lecture series conducted by Disha Bharat as a part of MyBHARAT campaign. I'm Pujita, volunteer of Disha Bharat. Disha Bharat, an NGO established in the year 2005, focuses on holistic character development of the youth for enabling them to engage ethically in personal and professional domain. The vision of Disha is transform youth to transform nation. As a part of orientation and induction in many university and colleges, Disha conducts value-based workshop. An eminent speaker, Srimati Soumya Chaturvedi, has made time to enlighten the audience today on Indian strategic leadership in changing world. Mrs. Chaturvedi is a scholar of international relations and security studies. A lawyer by education, she holds a postgraduate degree in international relations from India and specialization in Asia-Pacific security from the United Kingdom. She has also worked as a consultant with Ministry of External Affairs, Government of India, where she was responsible for researching on possible priorities for India's upcoming G20 presidency, India's position on Indonesia's G20 priority, and analyzing the Russia-Ukraine issue in different multilateral groupings. Currently, Srimati Soumya Chaturvedi is working as a senior research fellow with India Foundation. It is a great honor to have you amongst us, madam. I request your good self to take over the session.
Thank you so much, Pujita. Thank you for that very gracious introduction. It is always a pleasure to be on Disha Bharat's platform, and I would really like to thank Rajesh Padmarji for giving me this opportunity. So I will try and make this conversation very topical, contemporary, and interesting to the extent that I can. Now, coming to the topic, Indian strategic leadership in a changing world. Before we try and understand the importance of India's positioning and how unique it is, let's just quickly reflect on what do we even mean by a changing world. Taking the contemporary times, so we go back to the 1950s, 40s, 30s, where there is a end of a colonialization that's happening all across the world. There is a retreat of the colonial powers. A lot of nascent sovereign states are coming up, and there's a constant fear of instability because we have a lot of young sovereign states, and this is happening all throughout the 20th century. In somewhere in midway, we also see an ideological war that is playing out between the US and the Soviet Russia. There is a democracy and capitalism versus communism sort of a fight that is going on. And sometimes in the late 80s, early 90s, we see a collapse of the USSR, and we see this American moment of hegemony, which meant there was an attempt at democratization, and we see a lot of this playing out essentially in Middle East and also sort of failing to some extent. Then we also see some kind of liberalization, globalization, capitalism at play. This was then followed by sometime around the same time is also the rise of China, which is becoming a global phenomena. The entire world is talking about it. And then somewhere down the line, again, we see a US versus China moment, which then comes up with the concept of a multipolar world where there's no hegemon as such. China is still trying to become a hegemon. Russia is somewhere in the background, and we have a lot of these middle powers coming up. Just when things seemed a little bit more balanced, the world was struck with COVID, which essentially meant that a lot of development that had been made, there was a lot of backsliding that happened. A lot of countries became inward looking. There was a lot of economic pressure that was felt. There was a lot of social pressure that was felt. And then, of course, came the landmark moment in recent times, which is the Russia-Ukraine crisis, which again, once again, brought to forefront the failure of multilateral order in one way or the other. Now, when I talk about this changing world, there are some names that were very repetitive. We talk about the America, we talk about China, we talk about Russia in the background and then becoming relevant again. What's interesting is just this year, President Xi from China met Putin in Russia, and he made this statement, bits of which were basically he saying that there is a rise of the East and there's a decline of the West. When he said that to Putin, a lot of people said that it essentially means that China is signaling how China and its allies will be the next dominant thing in the world order, and China and its communism are the ones that are rising in the East. At this very juncture, the topic becomes very relevant because this is exactly where India's strategic leadership and its version of democracy steps in as an alternative voice which is rising from the East. And, you know, it would be unfair to say that India became autonomous in very recent history. It's not been that way. To some extent, India has always been attempted to voice its autonomous approach when it came to foreign policy, and to a very little extent, it succeeded also. Whether it was the non-aligned movement or the India-US 2000 deal that happened, or even coming up with a bargain with Iran right when there were American sanctions on Iran. So it was one of a kind moment. So India did enjoy some kind of autonomy. Why is this even relevant? What makes India's autonomy so unique? Let's talk about some basic things that are important to bear in mind before we sort of jump into how has India evolved from there. When it comes to superpower politics, um, it's also a theory, it is a lived experience that when there are two great powers, the world is sort of forced, the middle powers, the small powers, they're all sort of forced to take sides. And it is very important to then try and remain autonomous. To a very large extent, India has succeeded in doing that in its independent history. Look at India's contemporaries. Most of India's contemporaries today are either failed states, or they are dictatorships, or these are countries that are suffering from massive political struggle, social struggle, economic struggle. And there are very few successful stories for India's contemporaries. How many of them have actually succeeded without an external help? India is one of the only examples to have done this. While we did take a help from a lot of countries, our foreign policy was never dictated by any country. There was some attempt of bulldozing, and there was some attempt of India to try and portray itself autonomous, but it is still very unique, especially given India's geography, its demography, the kind of neighborhood that we live in, and most importantly, it's our cultural philosophy and our value system that has driven India over the years to make sure that we actually try and raise our voice whenever possible. What has changed dramatically in the last 10 years, and I think no matter how much we talk about it, it will remain rather uncelebrated, is how India became from a feeble, autonomous voice emerging out of fear into this one country where we have a voice of a strong, strategically autonomous, and a responsible leader. And why do I say this? There are three things to focus on. I'm talking about being strategic, being autonomous, and also being responsible. What India has done is it has carved itself a space in the world where the world is actually trusting India as a reliable partner. It is actually in a world order where there is a trust deficit, that the multilateral order is failing, people are not cooperating with each other, the countries are very skeptical of each other, there's a lot of apprehension. They all are still choosing India as a reliable partner, and this is exactly where I would like to pitch this dialogue of India becoming a strategic leader in a changing world order. Now, there are various ways to sort of approach this topic. However, I would like to focus on two main things to make it more contemporary, uh, and also I think relevant in today's day and age. First is about how India has navigated itself uh, and positioned itself within various multilateral organizations. This is a very important point. It has, some would argue, would also been like a weak point of India, where we were rule takers, we would go with the flow. There was only limited bargaining power that we'd had. And all of that has drastically changed in the last 10 years. And a major chunk of the appreciation should go to the leadership of our current leadership, because it is only their will, their farsightedness, their ability to make long-term strategies that has actually helped position India today the way it is. And second would be on a lot of these initiatives, which were very unique, and whenever they came or whenever India performed in a certain way, the world was taken by surprise. And of course, there was a lot of appreciation of India that followed. And I would like to maybe bring that up in the second part of my talk here. So first is the G20 organization. Again, this year has been all about G20. It's become the word of the year, if we could declare it so. Why is it even important? Why was so much of attention given to G20? Let's look at the participants of G20. We're talking about a whole bunch of developed countries, a whole bunch of developing countries, and a whole bunch of emerging economies. Now, G20 represents a whole bunch of
Seems like there's a technical issue. We will wait a few seconds for our speaker to join back.
Apologies, there has been some technical issue. We'll wait for the speaker to join in some time. Thank you.
Yes, my sincere apologies. There was some electricity lag here. So yeah, we were talking about G20 and the kind of participation that it has. Now, again, look at the dynamics of the G20 representation. It's a very important forum, and rightly so, as the Indian presidency. India, the government has made sure that it caters to the needs, challenges, concerns, aspirations of everybody on board. Now, ideally, as a presidency, we could have done two things. One was to maybe only pick up priorities where India has done great and use this entire year as an opportunity to, just portray India's success and not really take other things into account. The other approach could have been where India is sort of forced to, listen to one kind of arguments, whether it was for the developed countries or for the developing countries. We could have been forced or bulldozed in one way or the other to, just represent a certain kind of priorities or certain kinds of preferences. And all of this at the background of just trying to please them, right? India did not do that. India made sure that it portrays itself as an autonomous, responsible leader, which brought together the concerns of the global north and the global south, the developed and the developing countries, the advanced and the emerging economies, all of them on one plate. Now look at the priorities that India pitched itself. It pitched about green development, climate finance, and life. So while green development is a concept that's very close to the developed countries, to the global north, climate finance has been the go-to topic of the global south. India made sure that when we're talking about climate change, when we're talking about green development, we're talking about responsibilities, obligations, duties of both parts of the world and not just one. Let's talk about the next priority. India spoke about accelerated, inclusive, and resilient growth. Now, ideally, we could have stopped at accelerated growth, but no, we spoke about an inclusive growth and, more importantly, a resilient growth. If the last 3-4 years are testimony to anything, it is about how quickly our growth trajectories can change, how external factors, internal factors can actually derail our progress and growth. So India made sure that when the G20 countries come together, they're actually talking about ways in which the growth can also be resilient. Talking about the next very interesting priority is accelerating progress on sustainable development goals. Now, it is no secret that the developed countries perform exceptionally good when it comes to SDG rankings, as opposed to countries of the global south, including India. We are not ranked very high when it comes to the SDG rankings. But India made sure that it is a priority because it is something that is important for the entire world. We need to accelerate our progress. Now, those who would follow climate change would know this, that Agenda 2030 is basically a set of agenda that the world aspires to complete till the year 2030. In 2023, we are exactly in the mid-year. And if one is to follow, they would see that most of these goals have not been realized. And it's going to take a lot more effort, and the world really needs to come together and deliver to make sure that we are even close to the Agenda 2030. So again, once again, India did not give in to these pressures of or aspirations, but instead made sure that this is something that reflects the entire globe's aspiration. Next was technological transformation and digital public infrastructure. Again, a very progressive priority. India, of course, has done exceptionally well in the recent times on this front. And this is again something that is the demand of the global north and of the global south both. While India has developed a lot of more economical means of attaining technological transformations, these are still very high costs in the global north. When it comes to digital public infrastructure, I think again India has done phenomenally well, and it has, to a very large extent, it has also become a model that a lot of global South countries aspire for. Just an interesting take that I had. I was recently in Egypt for a bilateral dialogue, and we had a lot of countries from the West Asia, North African region, and they all spoke in just one sentence saying that they all want India to come and help them with digital education, because the kind of conflict-ridden societies these are, they have a lot of trouble with making sure that kids get education, and they all just wanted India to step in. And I think that is remarkable for a country like Libya to say that, or for a country like Lebanon to say such things, where they're relying on India as a partner and not necessarily relying on the West as the partner. Second last priority, multilateral institutions for the 21st century. Again, I think a phenomenal priority. India has always voiced this, that we really need to reform the multilateral institutions and make sure that they represent today's day in order. It represents current times. And I think it is very important to bring in that even in G20, African Union does not really have a permanent representation. It has been the invitee country based on the presidency's choice. Our prime minister, for the first time, has actually went on to request the G20 countries to consider a permanent representation from African Union as a mandate and not as a choice. That actually talks about India is actually looking beyond itself. India is a responsible leader that is bringing on board African Union, a huge continent with huge potential, whether it comes to critical minerals, whether it comes to natural resources, and it is so underrepresented in the world. So again, I think it just highlights how India is a leader, and it's not just fighting for a place for itself, but making sure that it takes the world along in this journey of progress. Last but very important is women-led development. Again, it ideally sounds like a concept that the developed countries would prefer, but our prime minister was very clear in his vision that without the participation of half the population of any country, there is no way we can achieve any of the above-led priorities. And I think the idea was not just to empower women, but make sure that they have a substantial contribution in our developmental talks. And I think that again talks about how mature India's way of thinking has been when it comes to engaging with foreign audience. Now, this is agenda issue. Great work. Let's come to political issues within G20. One, of course, I spoke about the African Union's participation, which again, I think is a political issue. In the long run, it is about, the kind of confidence the African Union will have in India to make sure that India fought for its representation. What is also very interesting is when we talk about Russia-Ukraine, it's not just Russia versus Ukraine. It is Russia versus Ukraine, NATO, European Union, USA. Now, most of these countries are represented in G20. And bear this in mind that G20 is the only functional forum right now where representations from both sides are there and they're actively engaging in and having a conversation. And I must say this, a major reason for this is the kind of trust both sides impose on India, the kind of trust both these sides, whether it's the America, the European partners, or Russia, that they have on India, that the agenda of G20 will not be politicized. So while there is a crisis going on and it has severe repercussions, that does not mean that women-led development is any low on priority. It does not mean that green development is any low on priority. And India has made sure that these countries have their full participation in the G20 agenda. And that's how India is taking it forward. And we just have the summit next year. So next month, apologies. So I think it is evident that the kind of trust that everybody is actually posing on India. And I think that that's phenomenal and very underappreciated. Second is the kind of development that has happened in Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Of course, it was in news. A lot of people had divided opinions on whether India should allow Pakistan's foreign minister to. Am I audible?
Yes, ma'am, you are.
Okay. So, yeah. So yeah, it's interesting to see how even the Indians were sort of divided between should there be a Pakistani foreign minister flying down to India and representing or not. And I think India proved to undertake a very mature decision of making sure that Pakistan is also represented in this forum. Now, SCO, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, is again a very interesting organization, a very interesting regional organization. It's gaining a lot of prominence these days. Let's look at the participants for SCO. We have in India, we have Pakistan, we have China, we have a bunch of Central Asian countries, and there are, of course, other participants. Now, SCO is very important for India's outreach into the Central Asian region. And as the president of the SCO, I think India was very mature enough to make sure that it has priorities which are not just acceptable to the SCO members, but is also a forum where India made sure that it voices its concerns and more so strongly. So let's look at the priority that SCO was given. This was articulated from our Honorable Prime Minister's speech in 2018, the priority of secure, which means S for economic security, E for economic cooperation, C for connectivity, U for unity, very interestingly, R for respect for sovereignty and integrity, and lastly, E for environment. Now just think about it. India could have easily chosen topics which were, easy to navigate, considering there was also a G20 presidency that was going on, and there was a lot of political issues in G20 as well. But despite China and Pakistan's presence in an organization, both the countries with whom we have substantial military stress, there's a lot of security tension, there's a considerable amount of disputed territory with both, and India, despite that, chose security and respect for sovereignty and integrity as an important priority area. And it also made sure that for this entire year of presidency of the SCO, these countries come together and express their thoughts. Now, there somewhere it's being said that India is trying to come up with a de-radicalization statement or something on those lines from the SCO. Irrespective of whether or not we are able to deliver a tangible result, just the intent of India to make sure it brings in partners that are not very friendly with India to talk about these contested topics, which are actually very tricky topics to talk with these two countries. India made sure that it is a priority area, it is not derailed, and the countries come together and talk. Again, it talks about the leadership skills of India to navigate through this. Last organization that I wanted to touch upon was the I2U2, not necessarily an organization, but a grouping. I2U2 is essentially a grouping of Israel, India, United States, and UAE, the Arab Emirates. It's interesting because the focus of this group is essentially to deepen technological and private sector collaboration in 6 specific fields: water, energy, transportation, space, health, and food security. Again, a very interesting mix of focus areas, a very interesting mandate only to deepen technological and private sector collaboration. Now just think about it. Israel, US, and UAE actually thought India of an equal partner, as an important partner to deliver this regional aspiration. Again, that talks very highly of how these 3 countries look at India in terms of delivering things that can actually benefit the region. What is more interesting is there were 2 projects that were announced under the I2U2 forum just this year. These are the first 2 projects under under this grouping as well. First is a $2 billion investment and technological assistance for agricultural initiatives in 2 of the states in India. Another project is support for hybrid renewable energy again in India. So for both these projects, India becomes the hub. The capital flows, the technological assistance, the supply chain, all of these assistance will flow in from the other three countries. It is important to bear in mind the only way these three countries would have agreed is because they knew India was the country that could deliver on these issues. Without any substantial result as yet, there are already countries in the region who want to be part of the I2U2, and they're discussing about an I2U2 plus forum and a lot of such similar organizations, similar sort of groupings. So again, once again, it brings, it is like a classic example of the importance that people have across the world on India on delivering substantial results, especially in a time when the world is so divided. I think it's always important to bear in mind the background or in which India is performing right now. Now, coming to my next, my sort of argument, so to say, is some of the key initiatives that India has undertaken in the last 10 years, particularly. Whenever these initiatives or these performances were sort of announced in the world, it took the world by surprise. Either they were highly appreciated, or in one context, when it wasn't very appreciated, the world actually said they understand India's concern and they did not really voice against India in any which way. And I'll start exactly with that. First is the energy security. Again, it's very important to bear in mind the government of India is responsible to fulfill the aspirations or to consider the aspirations of 1.41 billion people. And probably we are growing with every day. It's again, just from a very government point of view, they knew that energy is going to be very important, especially in the time of crisis when the world is facing energy insecurity, the fuel prices are going up really high. India had to make sure that it figures out a mechanism where it can secure energy for itself. Now, those who follow international politics and also for people, those who follow the market would know the kind of importance that energy has in actually bringing a dramatic shift in all these regions. It's very important from where you buy your fuel for international politics. It's very important on how these oil is being priced from a very market point of view. So India had to make sure that there is a strong energy security. Now, what did India do for this? India continued to purchase more and more oil from Russia in the middle of a crisis. While doing that, it did not stop purchasing oils from its other partners. India is also buying oil from US. It's also buying oil from Saudi Arabia. It is also buying oil from Iraq and Iran. The proportions of this, of course, vary. There are other countries as well from where we are importing oil. If I'm not mistaken, then I think we're also importing it from one of the Latin American countries. So what's again interesting is that despite the crisis, India is continuing to engage on the matter of something so sensitive, fuel import, with so many countries who are actually not going well with each other. These are the countries who have already taken sides in the war. And what is interesting is when India started doing this, there was, of course, a lot of concerns were raised. But more importantly, it was interesting to see how starting from US to every other country actually came out and said, while we don't like what's happening, we understand where India is coming from. And none of them publicly forced India to denounce its strategy. Again, that talks about the kind of autonomous sphere that India has carved for itself. Let's talk about de-dollarization, a very interesting word. It's the buzzword, and how rupee, the Indian rupee, can be a challenger in this game. Now, when it comes to the Russian fuel imports, India has been doing that in Indian rupees. There is also some talk about doing trade with UAE in Indian rupees. So once again, the world is sort of, at least few countries in the world, actually believe that Indian rupee is a reliable partner as opposed to a dollar. And these are, of course, there are multiple reasons. And in order to de-dollarize the world, we have to take a very, very long approach. And Indian rupee is just a very interesting contender that the world is pitching. And I think that is, again, a very strong indication of what the world sees of India and its potential. The third is that of climate change. Again, a topic that's very dear to me. So for those who follow the field would know this, but I'll just break it down in simpler terms. One of the sustainable development goals talks about reasonable consumption and production. What has happened is, over the years, because it suited the West well, the focus was only on responsible production because production was mostly happening from the global south. So all kinds of restrictions were imposed on net zero transitions and having a more carbon free, carbon neutral production mechanism. There was a lot of focus on how to make the production part of the process more responsible. What was conveniently forgotten was the responsible consumption. And I think this is a fantastic brainchild of our Prime Minister when he inaugurated or when he launched the Lifestyle for Environment campaign. The focus of the campaign is very straightforward. It's basically creating a lifestyle which is environmental friendly. And this is where we tap into the rich tapestry of knowledge, experience, lived experience of India when it comes to making more responsible consumption patterns. I think all of us are aware of using dried leaves. In a lot of places, also banana leaves, instead of using paper plates and plastic plates. Likewise, maybe using bamboo bottles, maybe using bamboo fiber. There is a whole way of living life which is very environmental friendly. It could also be, going back to the use of millets in our food production because they are very ecologically friendly in the way they are sort of produced and the way irrigation happens around it. So again, Prime Minister brought back the focus on the responsible consumption part of the debate. And this was something that the entire world appreciated. Nobody thought that this was also a topic that could emerge. And especially nobody thought that it will emerge from a global South country. So again, brownie point to India for that. Let's talk about energy transition. Again, the kind of focus that India has had on renewable energy has been phenomenal. I don't think I need to elaborate a lot on that. We have seen the kind of solar power initiatives that have been undertaken. India is also working to make sure that the other forms of renewable energy production is materialized. We're also working on one grid where a common grid can be made across the world, and you can also transfer renewable energy through it. It's still a work in progress. The initiative of Indian thought process of the International Solar Alliance. It is now an international organization. Something that started as a concept discussed between India and France and a couple of other countries is now an international organization that again talks about the farsightedness that India has had on these topics. Again, the example of Modera in Gujarat, the self-sufficient solar power generating and run village. Again, a phenomenal example. There are a lot of case studies that are being undertaken and how this can be replicated in different parts of the world, which I think again is a very good example of the kind of progress India has made. Another interesting topic is that of disaster risk reduction. Now, this is a topic that not only India introduced in the G20 and was very well appreciated by all the countries, whether developing or developed. India also sort of pitched the idea of CDRI, which became another international organization, the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, if I can recall rightly, and their project IRIS, which is increasing resilience for island states. Just look at the farsightedness that India has. While it's a growing economy, has its own demographical challenges, India is also making sure that it is catering to the needs of the other countries. We've seen heat wave all across Europe. We have seen a whole lot of disasters that have occurred in the global south part of the world. And India has been making sure that these countries can come together and devise strategies in which way we can reduce the risks that emerge from it. One example, of course, is digital transformation and the kind of role UPI had played. Now, honestly, when UPI came, it was a phenomena in itself. It was a revolution. It was a financial revolution in India. But even if then somebody had told me that I could go to Eiffel Tower in France and pay for the entry ticket using UPI, I would have laughed. I would have thought this is something that will probably happen when I am in my later years of probably 60s and 70s. It is phenomenal to have seen our Prime Minister and the French Prime Minister come together and actually announce it publicly that you can actually now pay at the Eiffel Tower using an UPI, and it will of course take a while before it's implemented. but the intention behind it actually talks about the kind of attractiveness Indian innovations have in the world. Let's talk about defense technology collaborations. 10 years back, it was beyond anybody's imagination the kind of defense tech collaborations that would be happening from India. Our Prime Minister is making sure that not only do we get the knowledge, we are also co producing a lot of things. A lot of these defense products are now being made in India and being then exported to our partner countries. Again, a phenomenal achievement because it has a lot of strategic value. And it is only when these countries see strategic potential in India would they share such technology. India is making sure that it is diversifying its supply chain, it is reducing the risk, and actually also making sure that the risk from one singular country producing everything is diversified for countries across the world. So India again becomes a reliable partner there. One example, I think, also would be the kind of India's economic clout that has been appreciated worldwide. Uh, an Indian company played orders for about 500 aeroplanes, and that was something that was appreciated by the US, UK, and Russia publicly. And I think that again is a very interesting sort of a development because one would not imagine, such a strategic investment coming out of India and also gaining a lot of appreciation from these heads of the state. Now, before I sort of move on to the thing, to the last part of what I wanted to share today, it's also important to bear in mind that in the last, especially in the last 5 years, I would say, and a momentum of this was built in the last 10 years, India is drastically improving its relationship with countries that don't necessarily get along with each other. So we're talking about Egypt, we're talking about Saudi Arabia, we're talking about United Arab Emirates, we're also talking about Israel, we're also talking about France. Our relations with US have never been more better. Our confidence or our trust with Russia has never been better. These countries, while they don't get along with each other, and once if you get into the kind of politics that flourishes around these countries, it's surprising to see how all of them are ready to bank on India as a reliable partner, knowing fully well that India is also great partners with probably countries that they have not great relations with. So again, India is very interestingly carving its own autonomous strategic space, a responsible space, and a trustworthy space. Now, before I get to the last part, just about an hour back, when the Prime Minister was addressing the Parliament, he said a very interesting line, and I'll just translate it very brokenly in English. He basically spoke about how there is a momentum going on in the world in the 21st century, and if India capitalizes on this, it can actually ingrain its presence and contribution in global history and the global fabric. The world will remember India's contribution in times to come. And it's I think it's great timing that he just said this, and I was we had to discuss about Indian strategic leadership. I think PM's agenda is very clear. He really wishes to place India in the global fabric in a way that the world will never forget its contribution. Now, in order to do this, I just quickly want to reflect on three major points, which I think could also be considered as a roadmap to reaching where we really wish for India to reach. First, it is very important to deliver on concrete results, deliver on promises and agreements. Now, of course, in the recent times, we have seen a lot of these bilateral comprehensive agreements that have been signed. And in order to implement them, our Ministry of External Affairs will have to work very closely with other ministries in India. And I think, especially when it comes to our trade ministry, for areas that are strategic for us from a foreign affairs point of view, I think some strategic investments should also follow. And for this to happen, our ministries would have to really work closely together. And also to make sure that not only do they deliver result, these results are quick, effective, and efficient. And I think the more this happens, the more the world's confidence in India would only grow. Second important thing, I think, is to develop an indigenous, regional and thematic expertise on a lot of issues. The reason I say this is the more global attention is set on India, the more there will be an expectation from India to, take positions on a lot of things that we might not be aware of. Now, I'm not talking about the government. The government knows the position that it has to take. But to make informed public opinion, we need our civil society organizations, our think tanks, our active members of the society to work with the government closely and make sure that we develop our own expertise on a lot of these issues. Say, for instance, there was a lot of chaos that has recently taken place in Niger, in Africa, and there's very limited understanding of what it could mean. And I think in the long run, there would be a lot higher expectations from India to be aware about this as a country. So I think we really need to work in that direction. Lastly, this is something that comes very interesting to me was the use of South Korea's culture as a national security strategy tool. What South Korea has done is that through its embassies, through its foreign presence, it has created a cultural acceptance or an acceptance of South Korean culture. And I think it's a very interesting and an inspiring case study. I think it is required and it is important for our missions abroad, our foreign presence abroad, to actively engage and develop an interface where stakeholders from India and from these foreign countries could actually come together and fill in the supply and gap, the gap between supply and demand. You know, Indian investments could go to these countries. Foreign investment could come to India on our specific developmental policies. So I think just taking that trajectory a little further, we need to have a very strong interface. Now, we are doing very good with a lot of countries, but there's a whole bunch of other countries, like I was talking about the West Asian and the North African, these smaller countries, where there really is a demand. And I think there is a lot that the private sector here can also fill in. So I think with that, I will conclude my talk. And I hope we can take Prime Minister's vision forward, not just through our own selves, but also through the government's efforts and as a community effort. Thank you.
Thank you, madam. This has been such proud moment for Indians to know that we are a reliable partner in the world today from a country being unheard. So here are a few questions.
Yes.
Yes. There has been a much debate in recent times about India being its pro-Arab historic stance on Israel and Palestine conflict. Recently, there have been changes in India's stand regarding Israel. How do you think this will influence India's strategically?
Very interesting question. I think Israel-Palestine has been a slightly difficult area even for India to navigate. It was very, very recent. I think it was only in 1993 where India actually recognized Israel as a state. For the longest, it hadn't. What recently India has done is it has dehyphenated Israel and Palestine. And this is something that I'll go back to the point of India developing its own sphere of influences, cooperation, independent of what that country feels about another country. So I think in the recent years, we also saw Prime Minister's visit. I think this was in his last term where he went to Israel and Palestine both on different dates. India has been helping Palestinians in the limited way that it can, and it has, of course, strong ties with Israel as well. So I think at this juncture, because India is not necessarily a relevant player in the Arab world politics, Israel and Palestine is a highly politicized concept in Arab world. What India is doing is it is reaching out to both the partners without offending one another. So every time Indian Prime Minister engages with Palestine, it's not like Israelis have a problem with that. They understand where India is coming from. So I think we have crafted a very strategic, strategically autonomous strategy for us ourselves. And I think it will be interesting to see how the politics plays out in that region. Now, given that the Arab region is changing drastically, I think it's going to be a bit of a wait and watch. It is to see how the politics develops there in order for India to decide if it wants to deepen its engagement or have a status quo.
So the next question is, India has enormous potential to emerge as a global soft power, but we are doing enough to assert are we doing enough to assert the soft power? And as citizens, what do we do with this regard?
Okay, again, very interesting question. I think this is something that I resonate with. Absolutely. I think India has enormous potential of soft power, and there is only limited parts of soft power that we've actually developed. We focused more on our food, and we've taken it for granted that our restaurants are pleasant across the world. So there is not a lot of effort that is required in that direction. India's soft power goes beyond dance, dress, food. It goes into spirituality. We talk about yoga, and we've of course done phenomenally there. But I think there is a lot of space that can be given to cultural entrepreneurs. I think one good step in this direction has been to promote cultural entrepreneurs in India. And I think eventually it can then be escalated to an international scale as well. And I think here I'll go back to my point on Indian embassies being a little bit more proactive. You know how in Egypt they have India by the Nile festival. This can actually be a forum to promote a lot of India's soft power. And I completely agree, we haven't done to our best. But I think it's important to engage with the government, understand government's priorities, and help and pitch in wherever we can. There's so much that we can do on alternative medicines, the holistic health part of India's discourse. Yeah, I think I completely agree. There's a lot that we can do, and I think as citizens, one, we should promote it within the country as well, and actively engage with governments and find these venues where we can pitch our cultural entrepreneurs at an international scale.
Okay. Since culture is our backbone, I think that's the
Absolutely. And we actually garner a lot of respect from the global audience because of our culture. And I think we should capitalize it, and we should economically capitalize as well.
yes. Considering India's development in digital world and in many areas, we are still considered as a developing country. Do you think we are still a developing country? What would it take to be a developed country?
I think in the context of G20, that becomes very interesting. So when I was in the ministry, I learned this, that India is actually called an emerging market and not really a developing country. So we sort of pitch ourselves as an emerging market because developing country sounds like a redundant word now. These classifications of developed and developing are very Western centric. In order to become a developed country, we also will have to make sure that we perform far better on our social parameters. The poverty, the income inequality will have to go down. Our poverty levels will have to go down. And I think we are doing very good on that. It's just a matter of making sure that we ride this momentum, take leaps and bounds, measures that have value by leaps and bounds and not baby steps. And I think, yeah, we can become a developed economy in the Western sense of the construct. But yeah, I think it's a lot to do with social parameters than financial parameters.
The Western media feels that we are old-fashioned. Is this an issue that India should consider, or is something like India should not be? It should not, consider that, or how is it?
So I think, yes, there's a lot of bias when it comes to India from the Western media. And, a lot of it is, of course, their own personal biases. But I think our Indian elite in the past has also contributed to this discourse to a very large extent. So the kind of material that they resort to does not necessarily reflect the India of today. It does not necessarily even reflect India. It just reflects a mindset in India. So I think, should we get bothered by them? Definitely not. The way Indians should look at India should be from our own eyes and not from how the West sees us. But it's also important to engage with them. It's also important to have dialogues with them. It's also important to show them the other side. And if they still choose to go back to where they are, it's their prerogative. And I think there again has been some movement in this direction. I think social media plays a very important role in this direction. It is also important for our own people, our own diaspora, to stay connected to us in order to actually feed in the right kind of information or feed in facts. Right now, these Western media, they make opinions on opinions and not necessarily on facts. So I think we do need to engage with them, but I don't think we should get bothered by what they think about us.
Thank you, madam. This has been very insightful session. I think it's also been a proud moment as Indians to know where we stand in the world. Thank
No,
you
I'm
so
glad.
much.
No, thank you so much for having me here. I'm glad I could contribute. Like I said, I really enjoy being in Disha Bharat platform. The kind of work that they are doing, it is my privilege to be associated with them.
Thank you, madam. It's great pleasure to have you. Thank you so
Yeah,
much.
thank you so much.
I thank all the viewers today, and I request you all to participate for our next lectures that is happening tomorrow, and also the student lecture series at 7 a.m. We have our tomorrow's lecture on Challenges Before the Nation by Sri Rajat Sethi, an author and a thinker from New Delhi. There are lecture series happening for the students, and this is a 15 days program, and we tomorrow at 7 a.m. we have students program. Please log in and encourage the students. We have a state level essay competition, the topic being Bharat in Amritkal, Amrita Kaladalli Bharata. Please give in your entries before 25th of August 2023. Thank you all. Thank you so much. Jai Hind, Vande Mataram.